Chapter 3. It didn't take much time for Curtis to figure out that something bad happened to Marco Garcia. For one, all calls he made to Marco went unanswered and unreturned. The two of them were supposed to get together and hang out. The thought had crossed his mind that Marco was avoiding him because he was having trouble getting over Curtis's constant lectures. Curtis was always getting on Marco's case about being such a trouble seeker. He got arrested often, and Curtis couldn't stand it, especially since he was the one always bailing Marco out. But in Curtis's mind, he knew there was something more, that there was something terribly wrong. Marco hadn't just been ignoring him, he'd been ignoring everyone. Marco's parents, with whom he lived, hadn't heard from him since the night he and Curtis had run into Les Huntington and his weird friend at the arcade, and deep down, Curtis knew that Les had something to do with this. A few people had told Curtis he was overreacting, that Marco had only been missing a day, but he refused to listen to any of them. He needed answers, and though it seemed a long shot, he decided to give in to the rumors he'd heard about a fortune-teller named Nicky, who lived in the woods of Baker. He'd never believed those rumors until he heard from a good friend that she was, in fact, real. That confirmation had been what Curtis needed to go through with it. That, and the strangeness going on in San Sebastian. Some people were just acting too weird for him. Not that San Sebastian wasn't always weird, but now things were out of control. Certain people were walking around with blank expressions, constantly muttering, "huh," every few seconds, even though there was never anyone to talk to. It was like they were talking to invisible people. And then there was the discovery of David Hernandez's body. It was terrifying for Curtis to think that David had been murdered at the party that he himself had attended, the top half of David's head severed. Curtis made a note to mention it to the fabled Nicky when he saw her, but for now, his mind was only on Marco. After the 20-minute drive to Baker, Curtis had parked his truck at the edge of the woods and made the rest of the way on foot. Once deep inside the dark forest, he had been startled by some noises behind him, but couldn't see what had made them. At one point, he'd been certain he heard someone moan, "huh," which positively made his skin crawl. He prayed those blank-faced people weren't following him. Finally, he had come to a clearing to discover an old abandoned amusement park. At the front of the park rested a box office, and inside was a strawberry blonde who had just revealed herself to be the person he was looking for. "Are you Nicky?" he asked. "Yes, sir. And who might you be?" "My name is Curtis Merriman," he said. "Nice to meet you, Curtis. How can I help?" "Well, a friend of mine is missing, and I was hoping you could tell me where he is." "Oh dear, that's a terrible business," Nicky said sadly. At the word business, Curtis remembered the charge that was required. "Anything you can manage," his friend had told him when confirming Nicky's existence. "Don't be cheap, though." He pulled out his wallet, but Nicky stopped him. "No, I didn't mean that. This one's on the house, but don't tell anybody." Curtis smiled and put his wallet away. "Tell me about this missing person," she said. "As much detail as you can." "Well, his name is Marco Garcia. He's 5'9", 180 pounds. "Your best friend?" Nicky asked. Curtis gasped. Perhaps it was just a lucky guess, or maybe she was the real deal. Suddenly, Nicky, who had been wearing a kind smile, frowned. "Curtis, I'm afraid Marco is dead." Curtis's heart suddenly started beating so loudly he could barely hear anything else. "Are you sure? How do you know?" "I can see the link in my head. I see that another friend is also dead." Bile rose in Curtis's throat. "David," he confirmed quietly before he could stop himself. He was close to vomiting. At first, he was ready to dismiss Nikki's claim that Marco was dead, but found it impossible once she'd mentioned David. "I truly am sorry," she offered. "What happened to Marco?" Curtis asked desperately. "He was murdered. Murdered by the same man who killed David." She looked anxious now, as if she suddenly realized something important. "In fact, there's someone here I think you should talk to." A noise caught Curtis's attention. He spun around and saw a pale figure walking among the trees. It was too dark to get a good look, but Curtis had the distinct feeling the figure was a girl. After a moment, the figure was close enough to see. It was a young, black-haired girl. She was wearing a pale blue dress. Her skin was ghostly white. She looked lost. "Looks like you have another customer," Curtis told Nikki. "I don't think so," she said awkwardly. Curtis turned back to see the fortune-teller looked a little scared. The ghostly girl was now walking toward the park entrance. That's when Curtis noticed two more figures emerging from the woods. One was a little boy around 10 years old, the other an old woman. Both were just as pale as the young woman. "I think you should come inside," Nikki told Curtis. She was opening the door to the box office just as he was going through the turnstile into the park. Nikki grabbed his arm and dragged him toward a small building to the right. It looked like a gift shop. Before they could get there, someone emerged from the side of the building. It was a pale old man. Curtis and Nikki were close enough to see the man's face clearly. There was something dripping from his eyes. It looked black against his wrinkled white skin. The man blocked the entrance to the shop now. Nikki and Curtis started walking back toward the box office when the old man noticed them. "Huh?" he moaned. The sound of that sent a shiver down Curtis's spine. Nikki yanked him back the way they had come. She threw open the box office door and locked it once they were inside. They were on the floor now, just under the counter. The ticket booth was incredibly dirty, Curtis noticed. There were lots of leaves and dead bugs littered around. He was certain he was sitting on some beetles, but he didn't dare move. He could hear people walking around right outside. There was no apparent reason to fear the pale strangers, but Nikki seemed worried, and that was enough for him. "Huh?" The same sound was repeated over and over in a variety of different voices. Some young, others old, male and female. "What are they doing?" Curtis whispered. Nikki shook her head. There was a lot of movement outside now, as if more people were joining. Curtis could hear the turnstile. Whoever these people were, they were entering the park. Owen's head was spinning. What Nikki had just revealed to him wasn't computing. There was no way his dad could have created the orb. Owen had memories of constructing it himself. How could that be if he wasn't the one who had done it? A very brief thought came to him. Perhaps he had walked in on his father building it in his workshop, where he had always been working on something. Owen liked to think he had a decent memory, but maybe some of it had been suppressed. Darlington was about to walk out of the room, but Owen stopped him. "Is it true, what Nikki said?" Darlington only stared at him. His constant silence was incredibly annoying. Never mind. With that, Darlington left Owen to his thoughts. After a few minutes, Owen was also up and moving. Sitting alone in the quiet room was driving him insane. He was standing in the main store now when he noticed Darlington staring at something. Owen followed his gaze and saw a bunch of pale faces looking back at him. At least 10 people were standing outside the shop, all blank-faced, with dark tears dripping from their eyes. Owen was speechless. There were quite a few old people, but a couple of them were young. Just then, something struck Owen. All of these people reminded him of Chris the day he disappeared, from the pale, blank expressions to the strange tears. Though the thought had never occurred to Owen, he now knew these people outside the shop were not customers seeking Nicky's advice. They were something else. But why were they here? Almost as soon as he asked himself that, the answer came to him. The orb. Whatever he'd done with it earlier had something to do with what was happening now. It couldn't be a coincidence. Maybe it summoned them. But who were these people? Were they suffering from the same affliction as Chris? Had they been bitten by the monster Owen and his friends last hunted? Was Chris here too? He was bitten, after all. Owen stepped closer to the door and peered out onto the fairgrounds. There were a few more people shuffling toward him. They reminded him of zombies. Chris wasn't among them, though. While looking outside, Owen noticed someone waving at him from the box office. It was Nicky, and she was terrified. He had no idea what to do. "Do you think you can get to Nicky?" he asked Darlington. Darlington said nothing, but gave a quick nod. Owen ran back to the reading room to grab the orb. When he returned, Darlington was already outside, trying to make his way through the zombie crowd. It wasn't easy for him, though. A couple of people shoved him around, still wearing blank masks. There had to be 20 people inside the park now. The ones Owen initially saw were still staring at him. The others who were entering the park were either coming toward the gift shop or joining in the shoving of Darlington. And now Darlington was shoving back. His long limbs gave him quite a reach. He managed to knock a few down, but others were now ganging up on him. A gray-skinned boy, no older than 12, grabbed Darlington, lifted him over his head, and threw him into the air. Darlington landed just outside the box office. Owen saw Nicky help him inside. The zombies closest to the entrance were attacking the little shack now. Owen went back into Nicky's reading room. There had to be an exit somewhere. And then he saw it. He ran to it and opened the door slowly. The coast was clear. He decided he needed a clear view of his surroundings, so he climbed to the roof of the gift shop. Once there, he saw the park was now filled with zombies. Some were attacking the box office. Others were looking up at him. It was as if the place was open for business. This was probably the most people this park had seen in years. Something told him the orb had everything to do with this, so he held it over his head, displaying it to the zombies. The effect was immediate. The zombies at the box office stopped attacking it and turned their attention to Owen. Without realizing it, Owen was messing with the orb again, his fingers working blindly across the smooth surface. Something was happening. The orb began to glow from within. He looked down, not knowing what he'd just done. Suddenly, the light expanded, washing over the crowd below. The zombies swayed slightly, as if a powerful breeze had just gone by. Then there was absolute silence. The zombies were no longer saying, "huh." Even normal outdoor noises like frogs and insects ceased. Everything just stopped. And then Owen remembered Nicky and Darlington in the ticket booth. Had they been affected as well? He called to them, his voice cutting through the silent air like a knife. The office door opened and Nicky poked her head out. Her face looked blank. "Are you all right?" Owen asked, his heart beating a little faster. She gave him a thumbs up, clearly too afraid to speak. She hadn't been affected. The zombies were still staring at Owen. He had no idea what to do now. Why were they so still? It was like they were waiting for something. Another question crossed his mind. What had happened to all these people? There was no question that whatever Owen had done with the orb earlier that night had called them all here. But why did it affect them in the first place? All of these zombies had the blank, pale expression Chris had worn the night he disappeared. They were all crying what appeared to be dark tears, the same as Chris. The only thing Owen could think was that Chris had been bitten by Eric, and Eric wasn't human. Stephanie Polanski, Chris's friend, had also been bitten by Eric and was currently in a coma, brought on by a toxin he secreted. Was it possible that everyone here was suffering from the same thing? It couldn't be. The thing that had bitten Chris and Stephanie had been badly injured in an alley fight, and there were way too many people here to have been attacked by that shape-shifting creature. Unless there were more of them out there. Owen greatly wished Eric had been the last of his kind, and though Owen hadn't killed him for sure, there was no way Eric was responsible for this epidemic. Nicky was walking out of the box office, with Darlington limping close behind her. And then Owen noticed a third person joining them. He looked familiar, but Owen couldn't place him. For some reason, the trio was walking into the zombie crowd instead of away. Owen assumed they were trying to get back to the gift shop. The vaguely familiar guy looked nervous, though the pale crowd seemed not to even notice them. Curtis couldn't believe the situation he was in. He was surrounded by what appeared to be zombies, and for some reason, instead of turning around and leaving, the psychic and her bizarre-looking friend were heading back into the thick of it. "What are you doing?" he whispered to Nicky. "I'm not leaving," she said defiantly. "Nobody's stopping you, though." Curtis looked around. He was surrounded by pale, expressionless zombies who were crying what looked like syrup. They were all staring at a blonde-haired boy standing on the roof of the gift shop. Stopping dead in his tracks, Curtis watched Nicky and her friend walk away. Enough was enough. He turned around and was startled to see the path they had taken was closed in by the zombies. They were all looking at him. "Huh?" One of them, a middle-aged man, moaned. And then another joined in, and now several were moaning the word. Curtis started shaking uncontrollably. He attempted to push through the crowd, but they resisted. "Huh?" Another squeaked, making Curtis jump. Why did they keep saying that? He tried to find a path on either side of him, but these zombie freaks seemed to be closing in. Curtis started to panic. A hand brushed against the small of his back, making him yell involuntarily. Another hand touched his shoulder. Curtis shifted and the hand fell away. Apparently, the zombies were coming out of their stupors and were taking an interest in him, and for the first time that night, Curtis Merriman feared for his life. Owen noticed pretty quickly that something was happening toward the rear of the zombie gatherers. The vaguely familiar boy had turned back and was trying to leave the park when the zombies blocked his way and started harassing him. It was only a matter of time before they really started getting rough. Knowing he had to do something, Owen set the orb down on the roof and looked for a way to the ground. The middle of the zombie crowd turned their attention toward the rear while the front suddenly became interested in Nicky and Darlington, who were near the entrance of the gift shop. She was only a few feet from the entrance of the shop, but Nicky could feel the atmosphere change. The zombies, who had been ignoring her and Darlington, were now looking straight at them. "Huh?" one of them said behind her. Nicky didn't see which one, but she tried to read anything she could from the voice. She saw nothing whatsoever. This frightened her. The person to whom the voice belonged appeared to be an empty shell. Nicky had never encountered anyone like that before. The orb had given her similar results, but objects were often harder to read than people. Fingers brushed against the back of her neck, making her shriek. Darlington spun around and grabbed that person's arm, and that's when a sudden violent wave of bodies crashed down upon them. Owen saw it all. The zombies suddenly attacked Nicky and Darlington in one fierce and quick motion. Owen was about to jump down and help when several pale figures exploded outward. Darlington lifted one of them over his head. Nicky was on the ground, kicking at several as they approached. The other guy was also in danger, so Owen decided to help him first. He leapt far from the roof of the gift shop and landed in a clear patch of land a few feet from the zombies. The guy fought them off as best he could. Owen kicked a couple away and threw a few more. When he was close enough, he grabbed the helpless man and ushered him toward Nicky and Darlington. Once there, the four of them ran into the gift shop and secured the doors. The zombies smashed against the windows and walls, but the glass proved surprisingly strong. "What the hell is going on?" the new guy asked. Owen studied him closely. He looked so familiar. And then it hit him. He was friends with David Hernandez. His name was Curtis Merriman. The orb! Owen suddenly remembered he'd left it on the roof. He didn't worry that the zombies would take it, but figured it best to reclaim it anyway. "Look," he said to the others. "I'm going to distract these things. You guys head for town. You have a car, right?" he asked Curtis. Curtis nodded quickly. He looked more than ready to leave this place. Nicky, however, did not. "Don't tell me you're not leaving," Owen warned. "This is my home." "You told me it was temporary," Owen said, remembering what she said the night he met her, that she was saving up to buy a place. "I think now is the time to move." The zombies were still pounding on the doors. The glass was starting to crack. Time was short. "Fine," Nicky surrendered. Owen smiled and patted her on the shoulder. "You guys get to his car," he said, pointing to Curtis. "Drive to the nearest gas station and I'll meet you there." They nodded their understanding. Owen ran to the rear exit, hoping it would once again be clear. It was, so he climbed to the roof and grabbed the orb. Looking down, he saw the zombie crowd bunched together, trying to get into the gift shop in one big wave. Noticing the Ferris wheel, Owen decided that would be a good place to draw the zombies. It was far away from the exit, so the others could slip by, behind the monsters' backs. Owen jumped onto the roof of the next building, a restaurant, and made his way effortlessly to the Ferris wheel. The zombies hadn't noticed him yet. He jumped down onto the ground and ran as fast as he could. Stopping just in front of the wheel, he spun around to face the horde. "Hey!" he shouted. A few heads turned, but the horde continued their attack on the shop. Owen looked down at the orb, running his fingers over its surface, hoping to either find a way to catch the zombies' attention with it, or shut them down completely. Suddenly, a few more zombies noticed him, then a few more, and then all of them. Before Owen knew it, the entire crowd was charging him. He turned and started climbing the Ferris wheel with amazing speed. The zombies started climbing with equal agility. Owen saw old men, women, and children climbing like monkeys to get to him. His fascination with the sight caused him to slip on one of the spokes and almost plummet to the ground. The orb nearly slipped from under his arm. After regaining his balance, he continued to climb. The old wheel began to sway gently due to the increased weight on its one side. Owen reached the top and looked down. The zombies were still climbing fast. Over by the gift shop, Nicky, Darlington, and Curtis ran for the park exit. Nicky gave Owen a quick glance before departing. Suddenly, the wheel gave a violent lurch. Some of the zombies were lifting the wheel off of its support arm. Owen fell down into a car just below him. The entire wheel tilted from side to side as the zombies on the ground held it up. Just how strong were these things? It was like their strength was increasing. A zombie child appeared at Owen's car. It was a boy, no older than 7. He reached out to Owen. Dark tears stained on his white cheeks. "Huh?" the boy said in a horrible moan. Owen pulled away from him just as the wheel gave its final lurch. The whole contraption fell to the ground in a horrible crash. Branches scratched Curtis's face as he ran through the dark woods. He heard footfalls behind him and assumed it was Nicky and her friend, but he didn't dare look back. He cursed himself for wearing flip-flops instead of sneakers. He could barely see where he was going. The moonlight wasn't penetrating the canopy of trees. It had been a straight shot to the park, though, so he was fairly confident he was going the right way, and that he would reach the street soon. And that he did. Soil turned into asphalt as Curtis found himself in the practical ghost town. His red Chevy truck was parked in front of an old thrift shop. He turned toward the woods and waited for Nicky. A short while passed, but no one emerged. "Nicky?" he called. Silence. Curtis hopped from one foot to the other, anxious to be gone from this place. He waited another minute. No one. Nothing. He ran for his truck and, once inside, sped off. Owen was in considerable pain when he woke up. He had been thrown several yards from the Ferris wheel as it collapsed. Standing up, he could see all of the pale zombies crushed beneath it. And then he realized something was missing. The orb. He looked around and found it near the collapsed wheel, a few inches away from one of the pinned zombies. He walked over to it and, as he reached down, the zombie, a young blonde girl, awoke and touched his hand. Owen jumped back in revolted surprise. "Huh?" she asked, trying to remove herself from her position under the wheel. Owen felt sorry for her. She didn't appear to be in pain, but he knew it hadn't been her fault, what had happened to her. None of these people had asked to be turned into brainless zombies. And now most, if not all, were dead. The girl, who had been desperately trying to free herself, suddenly lay still on the ground. Owen assumed she had died. He spent the next minute checking the others to see if any of them had lived. None had. After he was done, he went back into the gift shop and found Dee standing in a corner. His blue eyes weren't glowing. Owen, not knowing anything about the robot's power source, had shut it down earlier to conserve energy. He turned it back on and dressed it in the long trench coat and hat he had stolen from Mr. Elfman, an elderly neighbor from Owen's condo. After the robot was dressed, Owen ordered Dee to follow him into town. Curtis waited in agitation at the first gas station he could find, hoping someone from that amusement park would show up like they said they would. He resisted the urge to just go straight home. He'd had enough of Baker. He'd had enough of psychics telling him about dead friends. He'd had enough of Nicky's weird-looking friend who looked more alien than human. Curtis Merriman had had enough of pale-faced zombies saying, "Huh?" over and over. But there was something else. There was the blonde kid who'd saved him from the zombies. He'd looked familiar to Curtis, but he couldn't place him just yet. Just then, headlights appeared in the distance and approached the tiny gas station at an alarming speed. Curtis stepped closer to his truck as the car, a silver Honda Civic, came to a dead stop next to him, kicking dirt up from the ground. He'd parked next to this car when he'd gone to see Nicky. Curtis peeked into the car through the passenger side window and saw a pair of bright blue eyes staring back at him. The window lowered, and Curtis saw the shiny metal face the eyes belonged to. He was staring at a robot. The surprises just kept coming. The robot was wearing a brown fedora and trench coat. And now Curtis noticed the driver. It was the blonde from the park. "Where's Nicky?" he asked Curtis. "I don't know." "I thought they were with you," the blonde said, a little worried. "They were, but I lost them in the woods. I waited for them in town, but they never showed up." The blonde punched his steering wheel. "Damn her! I'll bet she went back." "What do we do now?" Curtis asked. "I'm not going back there, I'll tell you that right now." The blonde sat there for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "No, we're not going back. I doubt any more zombies will show up there, though." "How can you be sure?" Curtis asked uneasily. "They only showed up because of this." Blondie held up a polished dark red bowling ball. "What the hell is that?" Curtis asked. "I'll explain later. Right now, we need to get out of here. I think you should go home now." Curtis was about to agree when it suddenly hit him how he knew the guy. "Do you know a girl named Alyssa Turner?" Curtis asked. The blonde flinched, and his mouth hung open for a moment. Then, he said, "Yes? What about her?" "Oh, nothing. I just realized I remembered you from somewhere. Your name is Owen, right?" "Yeah. You're Curtis, aren't you? You're friends with David Hernandez. I knew him too." Now it was Curtis's turn to flinch. This guy must have known about David's death. "Like I said," Owen said after a moment's silence, "you should go home. You're not safe with me. Good luck, and I'm sorry about everything." Curtis nodded and backed away from the car. Owen peeled out and sped down the lonely stretch of highway with his robot. Tonight is so messed up, Curtis thought. And then he remembered what Nicky had told him when he met her and was told about Marco's death. "He was murdered by the same man who killed David," she'd said. But it was what she said next that struck him. "In fact, there's someone here I think you should talk to." Had she meant Owen or the creepy-looking guy? If the latter, then Curtis would have just forgotten the whole thing and gone home. But something told him she had been referring to Owen. Curtis hopped in his truck and followed the boy and his robot, and judging by the direction they were going, it looked like their destination would be San Sebastian.